On the right, you've got a population density map. On the left, you've got the same geographic hit, but with a different data set. The green is the Russian wheat belt. This is where most of the population lives. But the Russian wheat belt is not like most agricultural zones elsewhere. In the summer, the weather is roughly similar to western Kansas, so hot and dry. And in the winter, it is roughly similar to northeastern Alberta, so cold and dry and windy. Per square kilometer, the Russian wheat belt generates the least amount of income of any agricultural zone in the world. It's just that they're a major power in grain markets because they have so much land to work with. But because the net income per chunk of land is so low, Russia has never been able to generate the economic activity necessary to afford a road network. So if you want to move things at scale within the Russian system, it has to go by rail. What really gets the Russians depressed is when they see the beige. Territories that are not economically viable, but you can't do anything with, and they're flat. And so if you have a Mongol horde that happens to wander through, they can just roar right through it and get into the green and get fast and loose. And the Russians have really never defeated a foe that has managed to reach the green. They have to wait for the weather to do it for them. So the Russian strategy for the last 350 years has always been the same. Advance out of the green through the beige until they reach these geographic blocking points, places where you can't run a panzer division through, and then forward position those very slow-moving rail-supplied troops in the access points between the barriers. When the Soviet system existed, the Russians controlled all of them. When the Soviet system collapsed, post-Soviet Russia only controlled one. Everything that Vladimir Putin has done in the last 23 years, in terms of foreign affairs, has been about rebuilding those blocking positions. This was the Crimea War, the Donbass War, the Karabakh intervention. This is the Georgian War. This is the Kazakh intervention. It's all about rebuilding that forward position block. The scale of what the Russians are attempting here is immense. Their borders are 3 times the length of the US borders, and they're trying to plug them with a population that is dying and is half the size. This war was always going to happen. And for the Ukrainians, it's not so much that their territory that the Russians want, although they are. It's that 2 of those blocking points are on the opposite side of Ukrainian territory. So it's not that the Russians aren't going to stop until they have all of Ukraine. It's that the Russians aren't going to stop when they have all of Ukraine. This is roughly step 4 of 7 from the Russian point of view. And once they're done with Ukraine, if they can pull that off, the next set of countries up are Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, NATO allies all. This is a pipeline map. We're going to look first at the green lines. Those are the oil pipes. The places that matter are these 2 ports right here. In the north, you have the port of Primorsk on the Baltic, and in the south, you have the port of Novorossiysk on the Black. What's going on is the Europeans, the Canadians, and the Americans have banned insurance on all Russian vessels. For shipping, if you don't have a maritime insurance policy, you cannot enter port, exit port, or go into any constrained waterway like, say, the Panama Canal. So it's a big deal. In a part to get around this, the Russians are offering direct sovereign indemnifications, but you may have heard they're a little cash shy. And if something happens to a boat, it's about $1 billion payout. So assuming you're willing to suck up the price increase on the crude, there's a vested interest for a lot of countries to grab a Russian ship or two just to force the Russians to pay. Now the Chinese, in order to still get Russian crude, have at least a half a dozen supertankers and have lashed them together in a raft in the North Atlantic off the coast of Portugal. And they're using shuttle tankers to access these 2 ports. They're relatively shallow, so you can't get a supertanker in there, and shuttling those tankers out to Portugal and doing sea-to-sea transfers. Now there's Oh my God, there's no end of ways that this can go horribly wrong and trigger an insurance event. You can have a C2C accident because it's dangerous. You could have a country like Latvia just decide to snap one of them as they're going by. All of this would stop stuff from loading at the port. And that becomes very important very quickly because the Russian oil patch isn't like Texas. It's in the permafrost. If the ports can't discharge cargo, pressure builds up in the ports all the way back to the pipes, all the way to the wells in Siberia. And then the oil freezes in the pipes as it goes through the permafrost. The water that comes up as a byproduct turns to ice, and when water turns to ice, it expands and it busts the pipe from the inside out. The last time this happened in Russia was 1992, and it took the Russians 30 years to bring it all back online. Only it wasn't the Russians who brought it back online. It was the Western services firms operating in Russia, which are now almost completely gone. So all we need is one or two events with shipping or with insurance, and we lose about 4 million barrels a day of Russian crude all at once. The pricing for oil and for fuels and electricity does not follow normal supply and demand. If you need a liter of gasoline to get to work and you can only get 3/4 of a liter, not only will you pay whatever you have to do to get that last quarter, whatever price you pay for that last little bit applies to the entire market. The marginal supplier sets the price. So if we lose 4% of global crude because of the Russians, we can easily have crude hit $180 a barrel. And it won't come back because this Russian stuff will be offline for decades. We're going to look at the red lines now. The red lines are natural gas, and this is the one that really matters. This is the Nord Stream line. It goes from mainland Russia under the Baltic Sea directly to Germany with no transit states in between. It was responsible for 40% of German natural gas sourcing. So they didn't lose a marginal supplier. They lost their prime supplier. And they're attempting to replace those volumes with 7 different marginal suppliers. So of course natural gas prices in Germany are 6 times what they are in North America. People are only now starting to gain this forward to indicate what it means. Americans are pretty agnostic about where we get our energy. We get it from Canada, we make some ourselves, we get some from Mexico, we get some from Saudi Arabia. If no one's looking, maybe we get a little bit from Venezuela. Not how the Germans are. The Germans are in a much more constrained environment, and so they have to have a plan in order to keep the lights on. So they cut deals with state-owned companies whenever they can because they believe that that's more reliable. They bring in large volumes, and the natural gas doesn't simply provide the basis for the German electricity system, but also for the German industrial system. They use that natural gas for their petrochemical sector, and then the petrochemicals don't get exported. It's all kept in-house, and it forms the basis for their manufacturing works. Well, they've lost the first step. No natural gas, no petrochemicals, no manufacturing. If you want a Beamer, you should probably go out and get it because this is probably going to be the last one. The German industrial base is going to collapse over the course of the next year and a half. It gets worse because this is the German backup plan. Pipelines that transit the conflict zone in an artillery war. We're probably going to be looking at the Germans losing roughly 2/3 of their total natural gas needs, and there's no way their economic model can survive that.